All right. Ooh. That thing is on, isn't it? Good morning.
Good morning.
Do you want me to remove the mask? Or? Okay. I don't know about some of the women here, but sometimes I'm afraid I'll forget to put makeup on the rest of my face. So, and now it's going to be hung on something, I'm sure. There we go. All right. Oh, that's nice music. Very good. It is so good to be with you all. I mean, it was almost emotional for me to walk in today and think how long it has been since I've been in a church to do something like this in person, and how long I have gone without being with you all, because you are one of my very favorite groups. And don't tell the others I said that. When Kathy asked me what my topic might be, I had lots of options, and I thought, well, it's Halloween. And that doesn't happen often on a Sunday. I don't know the math, but I'm sure it happens more than I think. And I thought, well, is there a story in the Hebrew Bible that might fit the time? And actually, as my information says up there, the title, that this is actually a biblical ghost story. And it comes from, and I just have to make a plug at the moment, my book finally came out in August, More Than a Womb, Child-Free Women in the Hebrew Bible as Agents of the Holy. And I probably have mentioned this in the past. It took me forever to get this done. If it had not been for COVID, it might not be done right now. So that was a good outcome of my having to be, at home with nothing else to do. But in the book, I talk about several female characters in the Hebrew Bible who are never described as mothers and never called barren, but are in the story for doing something that's beyond their reproductive capabilities. And in the last chapter of the book, I identify 3 unnamed women who also fit in this category. 2 are wise women, wise woman of Tekoa and the wise woman of Abel. And the third is a story about what usually is identified as the Witch of Endor. Now, I don't know if you've read that text or heard many sermons on the Witch of Endor. If you haven't been around me, you may not have done so. It is an unusual story. And I apologize, some of the art might be a little revealing, but I didn't paint it, I just put up some depictions. Does anyone know where the Witch of Endor shows up in popular culture?
Endora?
Yes, Endora from the show Bewitched. Samantha's mother's name was Endora, and it really is a connection to this biblical story. But I play around with the title because when we say witch, we get a certain image in our head, right? Big, black, pointy hat, broom, all that. And that is not who this woman is. It's not how she's portrayed. It is a very different sort of witch or medium, as I tend to call her, because primarily what she does, as we read in the story, is connect with the dead. Which, there are a lot of words for that. One of the words, necromancer, is often used in talking about her. Her story is found in 1 Samuel 28, and I just want to set a little background. This is toward the end of King Saul's reign. And you may remember Saul started out pretty good and went downhill. And by the end of his reign, the spirit of the holy had left him and rested upon David. And some think Saul was paranoid, but I think he was just realistic because there was somebody coming after his job. But in the waning days of his kingship, the Philistines were a constant, very vicious threat. And Saul was losing confidence on what he should do and how he should do it and how to handle this threat. His advisor, the prophet Samuel, of course, has now passed away. And so he can't go to Samuel to get a word from the Lord, and it seems like nobody has been able to help Saul with his answer. So Saul seeks out what many would say a last-ditch effort. Another piece to the background is that throughout the Torah, there are several laws that say you cannot participate in witchcraft, you cannot participate in necromancy. Magic in and of itself is prohibited as part of the Torah. And in a preceding story, we've read about how Saul had said that all those who practice magic, be it a necromancer or something else, were to be kicked out of the country or killed. So he's had this edict about no practicing of magic. But when things get really bad, the only place he can go, it seems, is to someone who is doing the very thing he had outlawed. You might anticipate that, that would be something that the writers of the book of Samuel might frown upon and might condemn the woman who might be doing this necromancy. What's amazing is in the story, she is not condemned. And in fact, she's actually successful in what Saul needs, and she ends up caring for Saul, becoming a hostess who helps him as he's facing this great final challenge of the Philistines. So I'm just going to share the story a little bit. As you can see, there's a lot of artwork out there that deals with the Witch of Endor. I tried to not get some of the ones that made her look really, really bad. Surprisingly, Saul is portrayed better than she is, even though he's the one that sets the whole scene up. So in verse 3, Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and wizards out of the land. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim, which is kind of like a casting of lots, or by the prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, "Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her." And his servants said to him, "Behold, there is a medium at Endor." This, as I was reading the story early on, I'm thinking, well, he must not have gotten rid of everybody who was doing witchcraft. And she seems rather well known. It's not like the servants have to go get the phone book and look up, is there a medium nearby? It's as if they know about her. And one of the things we sometimes see in the Hebrew Bible is the very thing that has been outlawed or silenced is still going on. And we know that happens even today, but it kind of reminds us that it was never smooth sailing. Nothing ever completely disappeared when it came to worshiping other gods or practicing things like necromancy that should have been against the rules. They still seem to exist. In some ways, all that anti-language against magic, for instance, probably is a "we think you protest too much" kind of thing. It shows us that it's so powerful, it's over and over and over again, we have to hear that it's outlawed. So Saul comes to the woman of Endor. Now remember, she had her practice, her whole life business has been outlawed. But here comes Saul to seek from her the very thing he outlawed. Goes on to say that Saul disguised himself, put on other garments. You can't let the king be seen walking into the business of a medium. And they came to the woman by night, again, cover of darkness, always better. You don't do things in the daylight that you don't want seen. And asked her to divine a spirit and bring up whomever Saul asks. And the woman, very shrewd businesswoman, is like, hey, you know Saul has said this is illegal, right? And if I do for you what you want, you may then report me to the officials, and I will be without any options. I will be run out at best, or I will be killed. Saul, and at this point she doesn't know who he is like, no, I won't let anything happen to you. Nothing will punish you. And so the woman feels assured and says, whom do you want me to bring up? Who is it that Saul seeks counsel from? And it's the dead Samuel. And so he says, I want you to bring up for me Samuel. But when the woman saw and heard all of this, she realizes who's in front of her. The very person who wanted to cut off her life. The very person who wanted to keep her from doing the things that help her make money. Now, at this point, you might be asking, are there ghosts in the Hebrew Bible? What does that mean? And if you go looking for information on ghosts in the Hebrew Bible, you'll find hardly anything. Because this is the only place where we have a sense that we're getting an image or a connection to life after death. Remember, the Israelites weren't really into thinking about life after death. They were much more focused on life in this reality. The closest we can find in the Hebrew Bible to something we might think about as life after death, well, there are two things. One is when someone dies, they're often said to be gathered with their ancestors, which to me is that family reunion in heaven that we all want to have. The other piece is where it talks about Sheol and the shadows or whatever is going on in Sheol. Sheol is not a sense of an afterlife in the way we think about it. It's certainly not the hell that we have in our minds today, but something about where the things that aren't supposed to be reside, like perhaps a ghost. And as I said, there is absolutely nowhere else that we see something like we have in this story. It's interesting then to look at how the woman is actually described. I said medium, some say witch, but I was, in my book, I found this piece that I had written on her, and I thought, well, this would be fun to talk about. The language used is really like 4 words in Hebrew. It's Eshet Ba'alat Ov. Eshet Ba'alat Ov. Now, the first word's easy. Eshet is the form of the word woman. When you're in a construct chain in Hebrew, that's the way you describe things with lots of adjectives, or you say possession. But that second and third words, Ba'alat Ov, is very difficult to translate because it doesn't appear anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. Usually the first word, ba'alat, is understood to mean mistress of, like mistress of the house. Now, in today's world, when we hear mistress, we think sexual stuff sometimes. And so what I think is a better way of saying this word is like expert or specialist. And then that second word, ov, has been translated from a skin bottle to something like a pit to something like a ghost. And it seems to say she is the specialist who is connected with something. We really don't know what it means. Something that last word, ov, means is connected to the word in Hebrew for ancestor, av. So if she is known for connecting with dead ancestors, then that seems to make sense. The pit idea, I don't know where that comes from, but some people have translated it that way. But it seems she's a ritual expert who has some way of tapping into the afterlife of ancestors. So in the story, when he says, "Bring up Samuel for me," the woman sees something, and it's kind of scary. Like, what in the world? And that's when she realizes that Saul is in her presence and that he wants to call up this dead prophet priest who was very famous in Israel. And so the woman says to Saul, "This is what I see. I see a God coming up out of the earth." Now that word God, El or Elohim, is a generic term for God, and often just has the sense of something that is not of this world. Maybe one of the gods we would talk about in a pantheon of deities that Israel supposedly has let go of by now and is only worshiping and serving one God. But she sees this old man coming up, wrapped in a robe. And I love this image here because that flaming thing, I think, is supposed to be a reflection of what came out when she called forth the ghost. And we have no idea how she did this. There's no incantation, there's nothing told about her method, which maybe is intentional because they don't want anybody else knowing how to contact the dead, so they didn't put it in the story. That's left on the cutting room floor. But Samuel shows up. Now, imagine that. An old man in a robe, kind of wispy essence. And Saul is stunned. He falls to the ground because he can't see what she sees. But he can hear, we find out, what she hears. So Saul falls down, and he's so afraid of what Samuel is going to say. And so Samuel says to him, somehow I left out that piece of the text. Pardon me. I want to get that back in here. Samuel essentially is ticked off. He says, "Why have you disturbed me from my rest? What is it you want, dear Saul?" So let me pull this up. You can tell I haven't used this Bible in a while because I haven't been traveling around. All right. So then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me, bringing me up?" And Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. So I've summoned you to tell me what I should do." Now, you ask a prophet what you want to do, and you know that God is not with you anymore or on your side, I would say buckle up because he's about to get the news he doesn't want to hear. And so here's what Samuel says to him. "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you just as the Lord spoke by me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out the Lord's fierce wrath against Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you. The Lord will give Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." So, you know what your answer is going to be, Saul. God's not with you. You've gone against God. You've made these mistakes. So you're about to be captured, ultimately killed, and the Philistines are going to be victorious. I always think, boy, I bet Saul wished he hadn't called up Samuel. He could have lived in the fantasy world that maybe God hasn't completely let go of me. But now the writing's right there. And so when I pick up in this passage, we find out that when he hears what Samuel has said to him, he is just totally exhausted and distraught. I think I would be distraught too, right? So it says that he was filled with fear. There was no strength in him, for he hadn't eaten all night and all day. And the woman came to Saul. Now, again, this is the king who's tried to cut off her income, who has said she shouldn't be there anyway, who could, with a nod of his head, could take her out, or at least get her arrested. But she comes to him, and he's so sad and so frightened. And she says to him, "Behold, your handmaid has hearkened to you, and I have taken my life in my hand, and have hearkened to what you have said. Now, therefore, you also hearken to your handmaid. Let me set a morsel of bread before you, and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way." And he refused and said, "I will not eat." But his servants, together with the woman, urged him, and he hearkened to their words. And he arose from the earth and sat upon the bed. Now she has become the host. She has become someone who sees the king in such a dire straits that she knows that it's not going to be good what happens next, so at least he needs to have some food so he can, A, go out and face what awaits him, and B, I think just as equally, get the heck out of my house and not be found here with me doing this divining thing. And so she offers him food, and like many of us, when we're grieving or we're facing bad news, we don't want to eat, but she gets him to agree. And it's this last part that really finds some interesting scholarship, because some people think that the meal she fixes for Saul is some sort of necromancy meal, a meal for the ancestors, or perhaps some ritual that is done at the end of a session where you have called forth the ghost of someone who is now dead. The woman had a fatted calf in the house, and she quickly killed it. She took flour and kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread of it. And she put this before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night. Does that sound familiar? Take the fatted calf, kill it, make bread. I mean, I always hear first what Abraham and Sarah do when the three angels come to visit them by the oaks of Mamre. And I know I've said this in this class many times. This is the hallmark of ancient Near Eastern hospitality. You give them food, you give them drink, and protection. So this woman has done what you would expect of a person who extends hospitality. She did it to the man who had outlawed her work. She did it to the man who could have her killed. But at that moment, it's as if all she can see is someone who needs help. Even though Saul's a bad guy now, even though Saul's lost the favor of the Lord, even Saul deserves some care and some comfort and some food. Now, in the Hebrew, the piece of this that I find intriguing is it's a little bit more detail about what she does with the fatted calf. And there's a line in there that seems to indicate that there was blood involved. Did they eat the blood? Did they drink the blood? And as you can imagine, biblical scholars go crazy over that, because Israel wasn't supposed to eat blood. Everything they ate, the blood was supposed to be drained out of it. Now, is Saul not only seeking the insight of a medium, but also now participating in some ritual of the dead that involves drinking blood? As I wrestled with it, I could not find anything that indicated that the blood was a major part or even something that they ingested. But it gives you even more of that spooky feeling. You know, you're in the dark, it's at night, you've seen this ghost, and now you have to drink the blood of this fatted calf. It's like all those ghost stories of my childhood coming back. Like when, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say this, but when I was young, my friends and I would spend the night for a slumber party, and we would do a seance. And, you know, it was always spooky, never really worked, but we always got all, you know, nervous that we were going to get in trouble for what we were doing. And undoubtedly, that's okay. I was a child. I didn't know any better. I wouldn't do it. But think about the people who do a Ouija board or people who go to someone. And in many cases, I think the person who's saying they can contact the dead relative is taking advantage of these people. But for others, it's a very comforting thing. If you've lost a loved one, to think that you might get a chance to say something else to that person. Strictly outlawed in the Hebrew Bible, yet it still happened. A couple other things that are interesting to me. It says that Saul fell to the ground. In front of whom? We assume Samuel, but he can't see Samuel. So I have this image, perhaps he fell at the feet of the medium. You know, this kind of awe and fear. And he can't see what's going on. All he can hear is this voice. Some have suggested that because he can't see anything, the voice comes through the woman's mouth. Like she becomes ventriloquist for Samuel's ghost. There's so much that's not completely clear in the story that leaves us really wondering, how did she do it? Was there a seance? Did she throw out something on the fire and make it flash up? Or was it something very simple of going into a trance and then bringing up? None of that we know. We just know that Samuel somehow responds to her call and gives Saul the news he should have known anyway. And she takes care of the king in the end. I often have students say to me or ask me, well, if Israel really didn't believe in an afterlife in the same way Christianity develops, what did they think happened after you died? Well, there's several places where, like I said, we get a sense that you're gathered with your ancestors. We get also a sense, it's a passage in Ecclesiastes, which is a very comforting passage to me that says, when we die, that which is of the earth goes back to the earth. Now remember that Genesis story that we were made from the Adamah, the ground. We're groundlings or earthlings made from the ground or the earth. So that which is made from the earth goes back to the earth. And that which is of God goes back to God. And back to those creation stories, the breath of life, the divine breath, is blown into our nostrils. And in the first story, we're said to be made in the image of God. So the Ecclesiastes passage seems to suggest that that breath, that nephesh that invigorates us, returns to the source of the holy. That's one image that works in the Hebrew Bible. Beyond that, we don't get a whole lot. When we look at some of the Israelite customs from the past, we know that they are very focused on the anniversary of someone's passing. And so usually the burials happened in caves, not underground, and they would lay the body there. And the year after the death, they would come back to the grave, and they would usually take what was left, which would be bones, and put them into something and move them on back, because there was one cave for the whole family, and someone else is going to die, we're going to need more room and more room. And they would often tidy up the grave site, the cave, clean it up so it looked nice. And when I was learning about this in Israel, I got to thinking about my childhood. When I was growing up in Virginia, Memorial Day really was a Memorial Day, and some of you may know of this practice. Every year, my mom and dad and my sisters would go to Galax, Virginia, which is about an hour southeast of where we lived, and they would go to this one graveyard where all of my dad's family was buried, and they would put new wreaths on the grave. So that same sort of idea of going back, remembering the persons whose graves you're at, cleaning it up, making it look nice. And we'd go up there, and remember, I'm a little kid. And so my parents would be standing with my aunts and uncles and talking about, well, I don't think those flowers are as pretty as last year's flowers, or, that one has too much whatever. And I, as a kid, was bored out of my skull. So I would take off and skip through the graveyard, because it was a huge graveyard on a big hill with a little church. And, it was always windy there, seemed like in May. And I would walk around, and I was always very careful not to step on a grave. You know that, too. Step on a grave is a bad, bad thing. And so I would skip around, and I've told this story in other places. One of the things that always struck me is I'd come to a little headstone that had a lamb on it. And it always meant that a child had passed. And it was also good for me, my math skills, because I would take when they were born and when they died, whoever it was, and figure out how old they were. Always made me sad, though, when I would come across those children's graves. And I tell folks that it took me till I was an adult to know that Memorial Day was usually connected to military. And I guess because no one in my dad's family really had died in any war, I didn't get that information, though that does explain why those flowers that were never as good as last year always had red and blue in them. And there was a flag on every grave. But as a child, that didn't make that connection for me. I also know that in some cultures in Mexico and Latin countries, that they have a similar practice of, usually on Halloween or the next day, All Saints' Day, where they go to their family graveyard and they clean up. And some even have picnics right there in the graveyard. Very different understanding in my mind of death and our ancestors than sometimes what our culture tells us, that death should not be dealt with, and don't eat at a graveyard. You got to be serious. No, we don't do that. But I find such joy in that sense of we remember, we celebrate, we come back. Someone is not with us, but they're always with us. So when I think about the medium of Endor, there are a couple of things that I think, a couple of roles that I think she fulfills. First off, she's an independent businesswoman. There's not a man anywhere around that is doing anything with her. I've already mentioned she's never called a mother or barren. She is, in my definition, a child-free female character. She is a ritual expert, and in some places, the term shaman might be used. Shamans are those people who have some kind of connection to the divine, some kind of connection to something outside of our reality. They're holy people. And if she had been living in another place, maybe what she did would have been celebrated rather than shunned. And I think we forget sometimes she was a prophet, because what she did is get a word for Saul from Samuel. And as I said, some think that she was speaking those words in the voice of Samuel. But that's kind of what prophets are about, helping people make a connection, helping people see what they're doing wrong, giving them words of either encouragement when they need it or discouragement when they are in trouble. Perhaps, as I say, a prophet is a person who tells the people what they need to hear, even if, especially if, they don't want to hear it. And in some ways, she's a prophet, and then, as I said, a host. A hostess, we might say at times. She fulfills all those ancient Near Eastern customs of hospitality. And I think she shows compassion, and she's never condemned. And the people who wrote Samuel and Kings, we call them the Deuteronomistic history. The Deuteronomists are always quick to condemn. Because remember, it's written in hindsight, so they know where Israel went wrong and what caused them to end up in exile. But she is never condemned. Don't you think Samuel would have said, shame, shame, you're doing something you shouldn't do? Nope, nothing there. She just gets to be the person and fulfill the role that's needed in that moment. I want to pause now and see what questions or comments you might have about this ghost story in the Bible. I know you will always have questions or comments, so don't make me go to this front row. So they always have questions.
We're the hecklers.
Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
I'm curious, do any of you know someone who keeps senses, that believes that they are staying in touch with someone they love that has died? Does anyone know anybody who's done that? Am I the only one?
Nobody wants to admit it.
Yes, I know someone,
Mhm.
a couple, whose son died in a car accident at 18, and they went to someone like this person, and that was over 10 years ago that he died, I believe, and they truly believe there are signals they get from Nick and messages through numbers, comes through numbers, and they believe very deeply, and it makes them feel close to the son they lost.
It's, in my mind, if it helps you deal with grief, who knows if it's real or not. I think when my father died, I think my mother had an experience of a vision of him. She talked about how she was walking down the hallway and she thought she saw my dad sitting where he always sat, and she said it felt like something punched her in the gut. And in my, philosophical mind, that was the moment that his death really was a reality to her. And at that point, she began to move through the rest of the grief stages. My dad died in 97, so that's 24 years ago now. And it used to be, when my mom was more mobile, she would go and put some flowers on my dad's grave and make certain it looked nice. On the anniversary of his death, on his birthday, my sister who lives in town used to do flowers for Father's Day, again. And I, for the longest time, when I would go back to Virginia to visit my mom, I would always stop at the graveyard cemetery to visit his grave. Again, not because I thought I was closer to him at that point or something, but it was a way of honoring and just remembering. Right now, I can't go to his grave. This is probably TMI. But with my mother's health, I know that there's a spot on that tombstone for her, and I just don't want to go there right now. That'll come quick enough. Other thoughts, comments? Yeah?
I was kind of waiting, not being the expert in Samuel murder, that the rest of the story, like, are you going to say the next day the Philistines wiped him out and cut his head off?
Well, he did get killed. Yep. He did die in battle to the Philistines. Let's see. I was going to see if that's in the same. No. Yeah. He doesn't get killed until the end of 1 Samuel. That's what I thought. And the Philistines do kill him and Jonathan. And, of course, 2 Samuel opens with David's lament for Saul and for Jonathan. So the words were right. Sometimes, though, with prophets, as I like to say, they're just reading what's already there and interpreting it with a theological lens. The Philistines were huge. They had metal armor and weapons that the Israelites probably hadn't developed yet. Israel was never a big nation, so they were outnumbered. Philistines were going to defeat them. But Saul, unfortunately, was going to be not only witness to, but a casualty of that, and his son, which I always think is not fair because Jonathan wasn't a bad guy. But, he was part of Saul's family, and if Jonathan had still been alive after Saul died, he would have been the rightful heir to the throne. So the storyteller has us not have to worry about that. It's just David that we have as king. Other thoughts, comments? Yeah.
Does anybody say anything about too little, too late? I mean, he knew what he was doing,
Yeah.
and he knew it was against what God wanted him to do.
Yeah. Yes, it was a last-ditch effort for Saul. And according to the Deuteronomist, Saul's two fatal flaws were, one, he didn't do to the Amalekites what he was supposed to, that whole ritual ban, that when you conquered an enemy, you were supposed to kill them and all their living things. And he showed mercy to Amalek. And then the second thing was he was about to go into battle, and there was always a priest who offered a sacrifice before a battle. And Samuel was detained, and Saul got impatient and did the sacrifice without Samuel. And in the Deuteronomist's eyes, that's when he started going downhill. Before that, Saul we often think of him not as a king as much as a military hero, sort of like the judges, because his reign was never quite what we see with the story of David and certainly with the story of Solomon.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I'm always interested in opposites in the
Uh-huh.
Bible, and there are a lot of them. So, would you say that the opposite of ghosts would be angels?
That's an interesting question because we know that there are messengers that we would think of as angels today. Interestingly enough, the word for that is the same word you'd use in Hebrew for a human messenger too. So yes, in the sense that the messengers are typically sent from God to humans. So I could see that, whereas the ghost was something summoned by humans rather than a divinely sent piece. There's the angel who sees Hagar in the wilderness, and there's an angel that supposedly, or something Jacob wrestled with. So I've never thought of them as opposites, but I could see possibility there.
We have no trouble accepting the idea of angels coming with a message.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a thought.
Yeah. And some of the scholarship I read talked about how Samuel showed up even though the woman was doing something bad, as if she had no efficacy in the whole process, which I think is kind of saying more about the scholar than the story, in that they couldn't imagine that this woman who, they also say she's not Israelite. And I don't get that either because she obviously lives in Israel. So they try and portray her as negative as possible, many do. And they said, no, she didn't bring up the ghost of Samuel. Samuel just chose to appear. And I was like, well, that doesn't sound like what he said. He said, why'd you call me up? Why'd you disturb me? Good.
Lisa, you mentioned All Saints Day. Isn't that an ancient tradition or service that tries to connect with the dead?
Mm-hmm. It is. I mean, depending on what religious tradition you're in, some would be to actually connect with the dead. Others would be just to remember and celebrate those who had passed on. So many churches, even today, will have an All Saints service where they name names of those who have passed away in the last year. So it reminded me too, in Buddhism, there's a ritual they do. I don't know all the details. Wishing for more inspiration from Don Pittman right now, because I took his class a long time ago about this. But Michael and I, when we were in Hawaii, right as we were finishing seminary, went to a Buddhist temple, and they were having this fall festival or summer festival. And what they did is they put candles on something that floats and put them into the ocean, and it was called a Bon festival. And undoubtedly, they believed at certain time in the year, the dead ancestors came back and were more present. And then at the Bon service or ceremony, they were sending the ancestors back to where they came from to have more rest till the next year. So many religious traditions have something about that. And All Hallows Eve has a very interesting beginning and development, but there is, in many cultures, this idea that at certain times, whether it's an eve, like New Year's Eve or All Hallows Eve, that the liminal space between this world and what else exists is opened or at least thinned, so that we might be able to see something beyond our reality. Now, I have to confess, I'm not a big mystical person, but I'm not going to doubt people's experiences. Like with this person, the couple, if you get strength from thinking you can contact your dead loved one, I'm all for it. As long as that person, medium, is not taking advantage of you. That's the thing that worries me most. Other thoughts, questions, comments? Yeah.
When you were describing something and using Hebrew words, did you say nevish or nevish?
Oh, nephesh. I'm sorry. Sometimes that comes out and I forget that not everybody knows what word. It's a Hebrew word that's one of my favorite, nephesh. And it's like when in the second creation story, the Holy breathes breath into the nostrils of Adam. It becomes a nephesh, living being. There's no word for it. It's not soul like we think of, because ancient Israelites were not dualistic. That's a more Greco idea, Platonism. So the nephesh is what you are when you have life breath in you. And when you no longer have life's breath, then you're no longer a living being. You're not a nephesh anymore. Which, again, as I said, there are several words in Hebrew like that have no good translation. And so sometimes the best I can do is just use the word as is. But thanks for asking. I'm sorry I let that slip. I see your guest is here. So I'm going to shut down this and let you turn it over to your pastor. Does he need the...